Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I appreciate being here. All of you, this is somewhat an unusual way to meet, and I would mention this to our two distinguished witnesses. It's a little bit more difficult to keep the distances we want. But I think it was important for the Appropriations Committee to have this meeting. The January 6th images, all of us remember that, of insurrectionists flying Confederate flags as they stormed the U.S. Capitol, are stark reminders that domestic violent extremism in America is hardly a new threat. Our nation's history has been marred by the violent, deadly acts of extremists pushing a range of hateful white supremacist ideologies. From the Ku Klux Klan to Timothy McVeigh, we've witnessed and we've suffered through as a people extremists killing innocent people in the name of usually always morally bankrupt causes. The violence on January 6th was simply the latest chapter in this long history of domestic extremism in America. Attacks and plots by domestic extremists are at historic highs, the majority of them being planned by those on the far right, espousing white supremacists and related ideologies. In 2020 alone, white nationalists and like-minded extremists conducted 66% of terrorist plots and attacks in the United States. It appears we're facing a class of criminals who feel more emboldened than ever. And in asking why, we can't ignore a simple fact. Over the last 4 years, extremists who were once relegated to the fringes of our society, uniformly condemned by our nation's leaders, both parties, suddenly felt they had support the highest level of the United States government, and indeed in the Oval Office. We had a president who, instead of simply condemning the violence in Charlottesville, where a woman was killed during a white nationalist rally, he said to a nation, there are very fine people on both sides. When asked to denounce white supremacy during an election debate, instead of doing so without equivocation, he told the right-wing Proud Boys, stand back and stand by. He urged the crowd to fight like hell moments before they did just that, storming the U.S. Capitol. Well, you can't strike a match near gas and then act surprised when it catches fire. We need moral clarity and leadership in these troubled times. I'm hopeful that this administration, the two witnesses before us, can bring that to a difficult task before them. I believe it's critical for us to confront domestic violent extremism in all forms. And as chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, I'm firmly committed to doing just that. But let's not ignore the plain fact, as repeatedly asserted by the Department of Homeland Security and FBI Director Wray and others, that white supremacist extremists are the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland. Now, violent extremism in any form is wrong, but drawing false equivalence between this form of violent extremism and others only detracts from our shared goal of focusing our resources on the greatest threat we face as Americans. But we have to confront this threat the American way. That means protecting the constitutional rights and civil liberties that define our way of life. In the wake of September 11th, we let our deep wounds occasionally blind us to the rights and liberties we sacrificed in the name of security. I steadfastly defended those liberties and rights then, even when it was highly unpopular to do so. I won't hesitate to do so again now. If we secure our nation at the expense of our precious liberties, then we can hardly claim victory at all. We expect to receive the President's budget by the end of May. It's my understanding the President will seek significant resources to address the threat of domestic extremism. So let us come together, not as Republicans or Democrats, but as Americans, and confront this threat to our society. I'm under no illusion that we're going to eliminate the threat of domestic violent extremism overnight. But I am hopeful that if we work together, again, both parties, we can force it into retreat. And I think we should be able to also do what we've done in the past, show the world that America is capable of confronting its greatest challenges while living up to its highest ideals. I'm joined by the Vice Chairman of the Committee, Senator Shelby, and I'll yield to him.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this today's hearing. I also want to welcome our distinguished witnesses to the committee. Mr. Chairman, the rule of law, the very foundation upon which America was built, is paramount to our future as Americans and the future of our democracy. Selective enforcement of our nation's laws erodes that foundation. Today, we have before the committee two of our nation's top law enforcement officials, the two individuals most directly responsible for faithfully and fairly upholding the rule of law, the Attorney General and Secretary. You both know, as we do, that our country cannot afford to pick and choose the laws we enforce. And yet we watch that happen every day. Domestic violent extremists threaten the rule of law, but so too does turning a blind eye to the flood of illegal immigration at our southern border. I'll address each of these issues in turn from this perspective. First, violent extremism is a very serious topic. Unfortunately, many of my Democratic colleagues have sought to make it about politics and race. They would have the American people believe that all domestic violent extremists are far right-wing white supremacists and that all Republicans are complicit in their actions. Of course, both are false. I believe the overwhelming majority of Americans watched the events of January the 6th with shock and horror. I also believe that just as many watched the endless string of riots in cities across America last summer with the same emotions. They saw Antifa thugs beat and intimidate innocent people. They saw violent anarchists burn police cars and precincts and attack law enforcement officers. They also saw far-left extremists hijack Seattle and destroy the livelihoods of so many small business owners there. Yes, and they saw Black Lives Matter activists trash cities and loot businesses from coast to coast, night after night. None of these actions is excusable, not those of January the 6th and not those of last summer. They're all wrong. They all violate the rule of law. Yet, in the face of this utter contempt for the rule of law, so many have chosen to stand idly by, excusing one while condemning another. Such rationalization of inappropriate and even illegal behavior, I think, is dangerous, and I believe the American people see right through it. Moreover, it's dangerous for our leaders and law enforcement to focus on one threat to our nation while ignoring the other. Such behavior raises questions as to whether justice is still blind and whether the rule of law still has meaning and force in America. Let me be clear. This isn't about taking up for one side or the other or about advocating for the enforcement of one law over another. I believe the vast majority of the American people believe in the rule of law, and they see it under attack. I also believe that they want to see anyone who transgresses it to be held to account, regardless of race, political dogma, or other motivation. FBI Director Christopher Wray recently testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he said, "We at the FBI don't tend to think of violent extremism in terms of right, left. That's not a spectrum that we look at." I wonder if that will be clear to those who watch today's hearing. I hope so. I hope we hear from each of our witnesses about their efforts to combat domestic violent extremism, no matter where it falls on the political spectrum. I also hope that we will hear that there is a uniform approach to enforcing all the laws that are on the books. That includes our immigration laws. Illegal immigration has long plagued this country. It undermines American sovereignty and makes a mockery of our immigration laws. The failure to secure our border has for decades allowed the cartels, the drug smugglers, and human traffickers to continue their practices largely unabated. The Trump administration made a strong commitment to border security and achieved significant gains in restoring the rule of law along the southern border. Yet, President Biden, in one of his first acts in office, halted construction of the border wall that was ongoing and announced plans to unwind the immigration policies put in place by our previous administration. Sections of border wall literally lay on the ground next to gaping holes in the existing barrier system. Gates in the wall that need repair remain wide open and require Border Patrol officers to stand guard while they're needed in other hotspots along the border. Essential technologies such as sensors and cameras embedded in the border wall system have not been activated. All of this while record numbers of individuals pour across the southern border. The impact of these actions is not theoretical or abstract. Our border officials and facilities are overwhelmed. Tens of thousands, yes, tens of thousands of migrant children are in U.S. custody as we speak. This administration has restored catch and release, setting thousands of illegal crossers free in cities and towns across America without consequence for breaking the law. And inexplicably, amid the ongoing crisis, the Justice Department recently rescinded restrictions on federal funding for sanctuary cities, which themselves embody contempt for the rule of law. This action can have no other effect than further fueling the crisis by enticing those who seek to come here illegally. More parents in desperate circumstances in Central American countries will pay human smugglers to drop their children off at the border because the prospect and promise of sanctuary just got brighter. The ultimate source of laws in America, the Constitution, provides Congress with the power of the purse. Congress, over the past few years, has provided billions of dollars to the Department of Homeland Security for further construction of a border wall system, which includes functional gates and essential technology. Yet this administration has blatantly ignored the will of the people to secure the border as expressed in duly enacted laws. I believe that the rule of law must be restored for the good of this country. It must govern whether we are talking about domestic violent extremism or illegal immigration. It cannot come down in full force on one group of bad actors while giving a pass to others. And officials tasked with enforcing it cannot pick and choose which laws they will follow based on political considerations. If those things happen, the rule of law will lose its meaning and its force in America. And we as a nation will be in serious, serious trouble. I hope that our witnesses today, two of our top law enforcement officials in this country, will make a serious and credible effort to restore the American people's faith in the rule of law. And I look forward, Mr. Chairman, to the question and answer period. Thank you for the hearing.
Thank you very much. And before I introduce the witnesses, this hearing is a hybrid hearing. We have some members attending virtually and some in person. I thank the two witnesses for being here in person. We'll have 5-minute question rounds. When we get to the questions, members will be called upon in order of their seniority to the full committee. If they're not available at the time they're called upon, we'll go to the next person in seniority, and then they rejoin the committee later. We'll try to put them back in order. I would ask the senators to mute themselves when not speaking. For those joining virtually, I'd ask you not log out of the meeting before asking your questions. If you need to step away, just turn off your cameras. But am glad to see the two witnesses here, and I know you've had to juggle your schedule to make it possible. I'm glad to have the Attorney General with us today. I've known him for years, followed his career ever since he led the prosecution of Timothy McVeigh after the bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City 26 years ago. The Attorney General brings with him a heightened understanding of the threat domestic violent extremism brings to our nation just from the deaths of people the deaths that resulted from that. And I want to welcome Secretary Mayorkas to the panel. We've known each other for a long time, and we look forward to hearing from you, Mr. Secretary, about the work the Department of Homeland Security is doing on this important issue. And we'll take your opening statements. I did note for the committee, I raised a question with, before he came in with Secretary Mayorkas, I am concerned about the number of attacks, cyber attacks, most recent seen on the oil pipeline. And I think we're going to want to have a briefing for members at some point. What are we doing to increase security in these companies, and to what extent should there be a responsibility in the companies if hundreds of millions of dollars are being stolen and they take it as a way of doing business and just pass the cost on to the consumers when they fail to put in the kind of security, cybersecurity that they should have in the first place. But I will yield now for the opening statements. Attorney General Garland, would you please start, and then Secretary Mayorkas.
Good morning, Chairman Leahy, Vice Chairman Shelby, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Department of Justice, and it's nice to see you here, Secretary Mayorkas. Combating domestic violent extremism and domestic terrorism has long been a core part of the Justice Department's mission. Immediately upon its founding, more than 150 years ago, the department pursued white supremacists who had sought to deny newly freed slaves their rights under the Constitution, including the right to vote. Members of the first incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan attacked and murdered black people, assassinated black political leaders, drove black farmers off their land, and burned their houses and their churches. The department poured its resources into combating the Klan, successfully prosecuting hundreds of Klansmen. 26 years ago, in 1995, the perpetrators of the bombing of the Oklahoma City Federal Building sought to spark a revolution that would topple the federal government. 168 people died, including 19 children. Hundreds of others were seriously injured. The efforts to successfully prosecute the perpetrators, which I supervise, required unprecedented interagency cooperation at all levels of government and a major commitment of the department's resources and personnel. Unfortunately, the horror of domestic violent extremism is still with us. Indeed, the FBI assessed that 2019 was the deadliest year for violent domestic extremism since 1995. In March of this year, the intelligence community, in a report drafted by DHS, the FBI, and the National Counterterrorism Center, under the auspices of the Director of National Intelligence, assessed that domestic violent extremists pose an elevated threat in 2021. And in the FBI's view, the top domestic violent extremist threat we face comes from racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically those who advocate for the superiority of the white race. Many communities have experienced this horror over the past several years. In El Paso, 23 people, most of whom were Latino, were gunned down while shopping at a Walmart. In Pittsburgh, 11 Jewish worshipers were shot and killed at their synagogue. In Charleston, a white supremacist shot and killed 9 black men and women who were praying at their church. And many acts of hate-fueled violence don't make the national news, but they still terrorize entire communities. The FBI has also highlighted a recent increase in attacks perpetrated by those it categorizes as anti-government or anti-authority violent extremists. The Unabomber, whom I investigated and prosecuted in the mid-1990s, is by some measures the most high-profile example of the latter. As with the Ku Klux Klan, Oklahoma City, and Unabomber investigations, the Justice Department is once again engaged in a complex, nationwide, resource-intensive investigation, the investigation of the heinous attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. In just under 130 days, the Justice Department has made more than 430 arrests. The prosecution efforts, which are being led by the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia, remain ongoing. In all of our efforts to combat domestic violent extremism and domestic terrorism, the Justice Department is guided by our commitment to protecting civil liberties. In our country, espousing an extremist ideology is not a crime, nor is expressing hateful views or associating with hateful groups. But when someone tries to promote or impose an ideology through acts of violence, those acts can be the most dangerous crimes we confront as a society. Regardless of the motivating ideology, we will use every appropriate tool at our disposal to deter and disrupt such criminal acts and to bring their perpetrators to justice. My written statement for the record describes those efforts in detail. In the past year, the Justice Department has shifted significant resources to focus on this area. The President's discretionary budget request for FY 2022 seeks over $100 million in additional funds to address the rising threat of domestic violent extremism and domestic terrorism. It includes additional funding for the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's offices, the Marshals Services, and other components. The Department is equally committed to fighting violence and terrorism that is directed or inspired by foreign actors, but I recognize that is not the topic of today's hearing. As to both, we will pursue justice in a manner that honors the civil liberties guaranteed by the Constitution and laws of the United States. Thank you for inviting me to testify at this important hearing. And thank you for your support in ensuring that we have the resources necessary to carry out this vital mission.
Thank you very much, Mr. Attorney General and Secretary Boyarkis. Glad to have you here. Please go ahead, sir.
Good morning, Chairman Leahy, Vice Chairman Shelby, and distinguished members of the committee. I am honored to appear before you today. Attorney General Garland. Every day, the Department of Homeland Security's more than 240,000 dedicated public servants work tirelessly to keep our communities safe and secure. Today, I will highlight the work our department is undertaking to combat the most significant and immediate terrorism-related threat to our homeland, which is the threat posed by domestic violent extremism. The terrorism-related threats we face as a nation have significantly evolved since the department's creation in the wake of the September 11th terrorist attacks. The threat landscape is now more complex, more dynamic, and more diversified. Today, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists are the most likely to conduct mass casualty attacks against civilians, and anti-government or anti-authority violent extremists, specifically militia violent extremists, are the most likely to target law enforcement, government personnel, and government facilities. The threats posed by domestic violent extremism are often fueled by false narratives, conspiracy theories, and extremist rhetoric spread throughout social media and other online platforms. Further, domestic violent extremists who act alone continue to pose significant detection and disruption challenges because of their capacity for independent radicalization to violence, their ability to mobilize discreetly, and their access to weapons. As a result, the Department is redoubling its efforts to detect and disrupt all forms of foreign and domestic terrorism and targeted violence, while safeguarding privacy protections, civil rights, and civil liberties. The Department is taking a new approach to addressing domestic violent extremism, both internally and externally. In January, DHS released a National Terrorism Advisory System, or NTAS, bulletin highlighting the threat posed by domestic violent extremists. It was the first NTAS issued in over a year and also the first solely focused on a domestic threat. In addition, this year I designated for the first time domestic violent extremism as a national priority area within the Department's Homeland Security Grant Program. This means that state and urban areas across the nation will spend at least $77 million to prevent, prepare for, protect against, and respond to acts of domestic violent extremism. The Department is currently expanding its analytic focus to more comprehensively review how extremists exploit and leverage social media and other online platforms, and how online activities are linked to real-world violence. We are also enhancing our ability to analyze, produce, and disseminate products that address the full range of terrorism and targeted violence. We recently established a dedicated domestic terrorism branch within our Office of Intelligence and Analysis to ensure the Department develops the expertise necessary to combat this threat using sound, timely intelligence. One of the Department's most important missions is to provide actionable intelligence to the broadest audience at the lowest classification level possible. As a result, DHS is working closely with its partners to augment its intelligence and information capabilities to inform public safety and security planning efforts across the country. In the coming months, the Department will increase training options and other support to help identify individuals at risk of radicalization. Among my top priorities is to ensure that our personnel can perform their critical missions, that they feel safe and secure at work, and that the fabric of our department is not penetrated by hate or violent extremism. In light of this commitment, I announced last month an internal review to address potential threats related to domestic violent extremism within DHS and ensure we are not compromised in our ability to protect our country. As I have said before, the Department of Homeland Security is fundamentally a department of partnerships. Our success depends on the strength of these partnerships, as we cannot accomplish our mission alone. DHS will remain focused on strengthening its partnerships across every level of government, the private sector, and the diverse communities we serve to enhance together our collective prevention capabilities nationwide. We recently established a new Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, or CP3, to improve the Department's ability to combat terrorism and targeted violence by leveraging behavioral threat assessment and management tools capable of identifying early risk factors that can lead to violence in communities across the country. Individuals who may be radicalizing or have radicalized to violence typically exhibit behaviors that are recognizable to many but are best understood by those closest to them, such as friends, family, and classmates. CP3 will help build local prevention frameworks to provide communities with the tools they need to combat terrorism and targeted violence consistent with privacy protections, civil rights and civil liberties, and our laws. Further, the Department will continue working closely with its partners to build greater public awareness of and resilience to disinformation. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today and for your continued support of our department. I look forward to working closely with this committee and with other members of Congress on our shared priorities, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. And we're going to try to stay on schedule because I know we have votes coming up. And Secretary Mayorkas, you talked about this internal review. You have to detect and respond to domestic violent extremism within the Department of Homeland Security. That sends chills down my spine that we have to even be doing that. Will you commit to making the results of that review available to Congress and the American public?
Mr. Chairman, I certainly will. It is vitally important that our department reflects the nation that we seek to achieve, protect, and keep secure.
Thank you. Attorney General Garland, I mentioned earlier you were the lead prosecutor in the Oklahoma City bombing case. And in some ways that feels like that was yesterday, but I'm sure even more so to you. You had a pretty unique perspective into our country's efforts to counter domestic violent extremism. When you commemorated the 26th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing last month, you noted that, quote, the terror we faced then is still with us. And it appears to me that the threat has evolved in part because of violent extremist groups. So my question to you, Attorney General, how would the Justice Department adapt its approach to combating domestic violent extremism to address how the threat has evolved over the past few years?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and that is an excellent question. That's what we've been working on for several months, and something that the department has been working on over the years. That threat has changed. There are a lot of different factors that have made it change, but of course the most significant is the ability to communicate over the internet at high speed and to be able to communicate in secret through encrypted and other channels. In the days of Oklahoma City, the co-conspirators had to meet together, and it took a considerable amount of time. In addition, the degree of lethal weaponry available now is substantially higher than it was then. Then it took 2,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate to bring down that building. It would take considerably less of modern explosives to do the same. So that threat is considerably, with respect to its risk of lethality, higher than it ever was. We are using all the lessons that were learned over the past decades, including in those involved in fighting foreign terrorists in the United States. We have much more robust intelligence situation than we had then. We have much more joint sharing of information between state and local agencies and the federal government. The FBI has joint task forces across the country of about 100 or so, covering every field office and many more. U.S. attorneys' offices likewise have joint anti-terrorism task forces that work with state and local law enforcement, sharing information all the time. And we're giving out considerable amounts of grants to help the state and local and territorial and tribal law enforcement to up their game in recognizing these kind of threats as well.
Well, I'm going to give you a question which you can then answer if you want for the record, and think seriously on this. What more do your departments need from Congress, and particularly this committee, to root out violent extremism so we're not faced with this discussion again 26 years from now? And I would hope you would be very specific in answering that question, and couch it directly. Because I wonder, we hear so much about domestic violent extremism and all its manifestation. I think it's safe to say that your departments are committed to combating extremism in whatever form it exists. But we have to start with some common facts. In October of last year, the Department of Homeland Security concluded that white supremacist extremists remain the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland. And that was what the Department of Homeland Security said during the last administration. So let me ask first, Secretary Mayorkas, is it still your assessment that white supremacist extremists are the most lethal threat we face in the homeland today?
Mr. Chairman, I do believe that the intelligence reflects the fact that indeed that is the case. And I very much appreciate your question with respect to the resources that we could utilize to enhance our efforts to combat domestic violent extremism, and three lines of work come immediately to mind. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, we have created a branch to focus exclusively on this particular threat stream, and that branch can use additional resources so that we have the analytic capabilities to best assess the threat and provide information to our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners to equip and empower them to address it in their communities.
But you do agree with your predecessors that white supremacist extremists remain the most persistent lethal threat in the homeland?
I do believe they do at this time, Mr. Chairman.
And Attorney General Garland, do you agree?
I do, and that's the most recent assessment of the FBI.
Thank you. I have further questions, which I'll submit for the record. Again, I thank you both for being here. I yield to the Vice Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my understanding that the latest operational statistics provided by DHS that this year in the Rio Grande Valley sector alone, more than 19,000 persons are apprehended by the Border Patrol were released into the interior of the country without a court date to adjudicate their illegal entry. Even under the Obama administration's catch and release policy, illegal crossers were given a notice to appear before a judge. My question to both of you is this. What is the plan for these 19,000 illegal immigrants? And how are you planning to track them once they've been led into the country? And are you in essence conceding that these people will be allowed to stay in the country indefinitely? In other words, what's going on here? Mr. Attorney General, start with you.
Well, the specific program you're talking about, I'm going to have to defer to the Secretary of DHS. I know that the Secretary is trying to prioritize his enforcement efforts. The resources are limited, and the most important thing is to remove those who are a danger to national security and a danger to the public safety. And I understand those to be his enforcement priorities.
Okay. Mr. Attorney General, federal law defines domestic terrorism as a violation of the criminal laws of the U.S. or any state that appears intended to intimidate or coerce. As I said in my opening statement, that was the case with the events of January the 6th, and the individual who committed those acts should be punished to the fullest extent of the law. I believe that. At the same time, sir, I'm trying to understand the difference between those acts and the ones perpetuated last summer by groups like Antifa and others that rioted, vandalized, and frankly terrorized cities like Portland, Minneapolis, and Washington, D.C., all in an effort to deliver, as they say, a message. My question is this. Sir, what is the actual difference between these acts besides the groups carrying them out? And if there is not one, how can you assure this committee and the American people that the Department of Justice, under your leadership, is pursuing all who commit such acts with equal vigor? In other words, you're not selectively prosecuting, but you're going after all lawbreakers.
Senator, as I said in my opening statement, and as you said in your statement, the role of the Justice Department is to investigate and prosecute violations of the criminal law, regardless of ideology. Your quotation from Director Wray is one I would join myself, that we don't care what the ideology is. Violations of law are pursued and are prosecuted. I think it is fair to say that in my career as a judge and in law enforcement, I have not seen a more dangerous threat to democracy than the invasion of the Capitol. This was an attempt by some, and I want to be very careful to not ascribe it to all because every case is individually decided. But there was an attempt to interfere with the fundamental element of our democracy, the peaceful transfer of power. And if there has to be a hierarchy of things that we prioritize, this would be the one we prioritize because it is the most dangerous threat to our democracy. But that does not mean that we don't focus on other threats and that we don't focus on other crimes. We do, and we don't care about the ideology behind them.
Is rioting and pilfering and all of this in our cities, where it breaks the law, is that subject to prosecution?
Of course, anything that breaks
Just
the law,
like any other break.
anything that breaks the law is subject to prosecution. It may not be subject to federal prosecution. There has to be a federal crime involved, but if it breaks the law, of course, it's subject to prosecution.
But a lot of it could be subject to federal prosecution.
It could, yes, absolutely it could, and the Justice Department looks for where there are violations of federal crimes.
Mr. Secretary, in the past 5 years, Congress has directly provided the Department of Homeland Security with billions of dollars for the construction of a border wall, and we know where it is today. I think it's an affront to this committee and to a lot of us for Congress and to Congress's power of the purse. But worse, it makes the work of our dedicated Border Patrol agents more difficult and more dangerous on what's been going on there. I think these agents must stand constant guard by incomplete sections of the border wall, which now serves as funnels for illegal immigrants, human trafficking, and drug smuggling. You know, I think the dynamics there are straining the resources of our Border Patrol under your leadership. Mr. Secretary, what is your plan, if you have one, to relieve Border Patrol agents from guarding gaps that remain in the wall due to this administration's refusal to finish construction that was near completion and abruptly halted in January? And are you planning to turn on the gates incomplete section of the border wall that's finished so your agents can safely patrol the other areas of responsibility? In other words, what's going on there?
Vice Chairman Shelby, we are dedicated to securing our border. That is one of our most significant priorities, and we have a multifaceted approach to that critical mission. Let me say, if I can, for just one moment, you mentioned traffickers and human smuggling organizations. We are very focused on combating their efforts to cause damage in our country. And in fact, just over the past few weeks, we launched Operation Sentinel to increase our resources and dedication of efforts to combat human smugglers and traffickers in every way possible. The border is most secure when we take a multifaceted approach where we not only rely exclusively on the physical barrier, but we have physical barriers, the use of technology, and a focus on innovation to make sure that we're harnessing the most recent technological innovations to secure our border, and, of course, the brave men and women of the United States Border Patrol. It's that multi-faceted approach that delivers the greatest security to our border.
Thank you, and we'll turn to Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Mr.
Who's
Chairman.
also the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee and is deeply involved in these issues.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Attorney General, you've identified the dilemma of democracy, where we state unequivocally you can believe what you care to believe. That's your right in this country, this free country. But when you take action in pursuance of your beliefs, then we have to take a critical eye toward that action to determine whether or not it has broken the law and endangers the rights of others. During the January 6th insurrection, New York Police Department Officer Thomas Webster has been charged with assaulting a D.C. Metropolitan Police Department officer during the attack. Body camera footage shows Webster attacking the Metropolitan Police Department officer with a metal flagpole, tackling him and trying to rip off his face shield and gas mask. This raises a question which is painful to consider, but we have to consider, and that is whether or not in the ranks of law enforcement, either at the federal level or state and local level, there are those who would use their political beliefs in a manner which is inconsistent with your earlier statement. What are your thoughts about how we can deal with this?
Well, you put your finger on the most difficult problem we have, which is balancing First Amendment, free association, free speech rights with protection of our communities against criminal acts. Within the Justice Department itself, we are beginning our own review of our procedures. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been discussing how to go about this. The Deputy Attorney General has met with the heads of all of our law enforcement agencies to determine how we can carefully vet our own employees. Again, always being mindful of First Amendment and free associational rights, but at the same time being careful that we don't have people in our ranks who would commit criminal acts or who are not able to carry on their duties. So that's one set of things, looking within ourselves. And the second are we have with respect to our joint terrorism task forces, we have a vetting procedure like we have for our own agents with respect to careful backgrounds. But with respect to law enforcement of the local and state level, this would require using some of our grant money for the purpose of incentivizing anti-domestic violent extremist training people, so that law enforcement is aware of what to look for and of how to go about the kind of training necessary to make sure that people who are involved in it are excluded from the ranks.
Thank you. Secretary Mayorkas, Senator Shelby raised a question earlier about 19,000 people who were caught and released by your agency at the southern border, and I want to give you a chance to respond to that. And would you also comment on the chart that says there are thousands of migrant children in U.S. custody, so that the record can be clear as to whether that is accurate?
Thank you, Senator Durbin. As I mentioned earlier, our priority is to secure the border. In a time of pandemic, we are employing the Department of Health and Human Services, specifically the Center for Disease Control's Title 42 authority, to expel families and single adults. We made a decision because the President and this administration is dedicated not only to a safe and orderly immigration system, but one that is humane as well, to not expel children. Families who are not able to be expelled are placed in immigration proceedings pursuant to the law.
Does that mean they have a court date?
That is indeed the case. They do have a court date, and if they are not able, we are not able to identify a court date at the time that they are apprehended in a Customs and Border Protection facility, a Border Patrol station. They are issued a notice to appear at an Immigration and Customs Enforcement facility. With respect to the photograph that I have trouble seeing, but I do, I can discern what it is. We have focused our efforts on ensuring that children are moved as quickly as possible from a Border Patrol station to the shelter and care of the Department of Health and Human Services. I have repeatedly stated that a Border Patrol station is no place for a child. We have made dramatic improvement in the movement of those unaccompanied children to the Department of Health and Human Services. We've reduced the time in Border Patrol custody from a height of 133 hours on average on March 28th to an average below 30 hours as I sit here and testify today. And those facilities are far better than a Border Patrol station, and we are likewise reducing the time that a child spends in an HHS facility so that we can unite that child with a parent, legal guardian, or family relative qualified sponsor here in the United States.
But you do not forcibly remove children from their families, do you?
We absolutely do not continue the cruel and extraordinarily inhumane policy of the past.
And you do make every effort to establish a reunification possibility.
We are dedicated to that. We are very proud of the fact that we reunited 4 families last week, and I want to acknowledge that that is only the beginning, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Attorney General, welcome. I commend you and the Department of Justice for seeking to identify and prosecute those responsible for the terrible riots and attack on our Capitol on January 6th. As the chairman mentioned, starting last summer, our country also experienced attacks threatening other significant government institutions, such as a courthouse, police stations. That occurred in Minneapolis and in what we in Maine call the other Portland. You have made very clear that the ideological outlook of the individual committing these alleged crimes is not important to the Department of Justice. But what resources has the department dedicated to identifying and prosecuting the individuals responsible for the violent acts last summer that were aimed at institutions like courthouses and police stations?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. As you might expect, I know more about the resources we're putting into January 6th because most of those resources have been put in on my watch during the time I've been here. I wasn't the Attorney General nor in the Department of Justice in the summer, so I'm not completely familiar with the resources that were put in during that period. But the U.S. Attorney's offices in both in the other Portland and in Minneapolis are continuing to work those cases, as is the FBI field offices in both of those cases. And I have not heard any suggestion that insufficient resources are available for those continuing prosecutions.
If you could get back to me with more specifics on that, I'd really appreciate it.
I'll ask my staff to contact yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Secretary Mayorkas, first of all, let me say that I very much appreciate the work of the Department of Homeland Security, and I personally learned a lot from a recent trip, my second, to the border to Texas, where I went with Border Patrol agents on a midnight tour of the Rio Grande. And across the river, we could see the bright lights of the Mexican cartels and hear them taunting the border agents as they were controlling completely the flow of migrants across the river. I know that you visited the Donna facility in Texas last week. When I was there, the conditions were dire. This looks great compared to what I saw. What I saw were children in pens on floors with no spaces between them, with just Mylar blankets. And those conditions were truly dire. We are, however, despite the improvements that you're working hard to make, we're seeing decades-high numbers of encounters at the border. And I asked the Border Patrol agents and also the migrants through a translator why the migrants were coming now. And they pointed to changes in policies that have been made by the Biden administration, particularly with regard to the migrant protection protocols. And one woman, a very young woman with a young child, told me that she was here to escape the violence and because President Biden told her to come. You have said that we will build the legal processes for migrants to come to the U.S. when they are qualified to do so under the laws that Congress passed. And that is exactly right. So how can we now reform or amend our practices and our laws to end the various incentives that spur this flood of illegal migration, which has led to very vulnerable people being exploited by smugglers, human traffickers, the cartels. What should we do now?
Senator, thank you very much. I have a three-part answer, but before I provide that three-part answer, let me say two important things, if I may. First of all, I want to articulate my extraordinary pride in working alongside and supporting the men and women of the United States Border Patrol. It truly, their efforts are heroic. Secondly, the Donna facility I have visited twice, once in March and once last week, and the change in the conditions there is extraordinary, and that is because of the men and women of the Border Patrol, as well as the men and women throughout the Department of Homeland Security who have dedicated their resources and talents to the effort. It's really a three-part solution. It is investing in the countries of origin, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and tackling the root causes that cause the irregular migration, that cause loving parents to actually send their children alone, and sometimes in the hands of human smugglers, to traverse Mexico to reach our southern border. Secondly, it's to construct lawful pathways so that individuals such as those loving parents don't feel they have to rely on those irregular and dangerous pathways, but a safe and orderly process when they qualify under United States law for them to travel here safely. And third, Senator, is immigration reform. There is unanimity that our current immigration system is broken. We have bills pending before Congress, and it is time for that reform to be enacted.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I agree with that last comment. Several members here are also members of the Judiciary Committee, and a few years ago we spent months putting together a comprehensive immigration bill. It passed the U.S. Senate, a bipartisan, about 65, 63 votes, Republicans and Democrats for it. The then Speaker of the House, even though there were votes there that would have passed it, refused to bring it up because it would have violated a rule they considered sacred, the Dennis Hastert rule. I think they call it something different now that former Speaker Hastert went to prison. Senator Reid?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Attorney General, welcome. Ms. Secretary, welcome. You have described misinformation rather, and disinformation as fueling a great deal of this violent extremist activity. In your view, would a commission to provide information literacy tools that people can use to make sounder judgments about what they're seeing on social media? And this would apply to all communities, but there's a particular concern with veterans and service members. Would such a commission be useful? Mr. General, please.
I think all forms of civics education that help provide education about misinformation that can lead to radicalization or misinformation in general would be helpful.
Thank you. Ms. Secretary?
Senator Reid would welcome the opportunity to learn the specifics. We're eager to have additional resources and additional vehicles to address misinformation and disinformation. I should say that our department is partnering with the Department of Education to develop a program in the K through 12 arena. And so to amplify that effort, we would welcome the opportunity to study the commission of which you speak.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, we have also seen increasing evidence that Russia is using this type of misinformation and disinformation to support and amplify a message of violence that we saw in Charlottesville, in the killing of George Floyd, designed to disunite this country, inflame racial tensions, and to undermine, in many respects, our democracy. And a recent joint assessment indicates that they are using the January 6th assault on the Capitol in such a manner to amplify narratives in furtherance of their policy, which is to disrupt and disunite and to indeed destroy, if they could, our democracy. So are you concerned about this nexus between Russia and these domestic terrorists?
Very much so. Senator, we are intensely focused on the information with respect to Russia's effort to sow discord and disunity in our country. And of course, we are bringing an all-of-government effort to respond to that. And I would welcome the opportunity to brief you in a more appropriate forum to address the information we have in that regard.
In this forum, can you give an indication of what you think the best way might be to do that?
Senator, some of the actions that we have taken certainly are public. We have imposed sanctions. We have attributed to Russia publicly the actions that we have learned they have committed. Those are two examples that I certainly can speak of in a public forum.
Thank you. One of my impressions from being on the Armed Services Committee is that there is a disconnect between our defense-related intelligence services, the Cybercom, NAS, CIA, et cetera, many because of constitutional issues of the inability of these agencies to operate in the United States. Has that left a seam in which it is being exploited, and are we making efforts to close that seam constitutionally?
Senator, you are correct in addressing the fact that some authorities are domestic in nature, others are not. The issue of seams, of course, is a long-standing one. We are very, very focused on closing any seams that remain or any residual of past issues. We're very, very focused on and developing resources to address that.
Well, Mr. Secretary and Mr. Attorney General, if there are legislative initiatives that are required to close these seams or to disrupt the flow of disinformation, please forward those to not just this committee, but to other committees of jurisdiction and interest. And thank you all for your service, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Senator Shelby, Senator Leahy. Oh, he's back now. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Attorney General, Mr. Secretary, welcome and thank you for all you do. Attorney General Garland, I would like to ask a question regarding the ongoing investigations following the events of January 6th. A couple weeks ago, the FBI executed a search warrant on a couple living in Homer, Alaska, related to the investigation surrounding the events of January 6th. The search warrant was unsealed just last week. We've had an opportunity to take a look at it. We now understand that the wife was or has been identified as a person that the FBI believes may have been connected to the laptop of Speaker Pelosi based on a picture and at least two tips. The couple in Homer adamantly assert that this is a case of mistaken identity. Certainly a lot of back and forth going on as to whether or not that is the case. But understanding that this investigation is ongoing, how are the Department of Justice and Homeland Security working with the FBI and others to ensure that while we have a thorough investigation that is ongoing, that it respects the constitutional rights of all Alaskans in this case, but all Americans. But part of this is just to ensure that public trust in law enforcement is maintained during the course of this investigation. There's a lot of discussion about how long is it going to take until this investigation is concluded. You have a small town in a state with a small population, and there's a lot of discussion about the merits of this going forward. So if you can address that, please.
I think this is the central question for all of law enforcement, to always be careful to balance. Balance isn't even the right word. The right word is to pursue law enforcement objectives consistent with the statutes of the United States and the Constitution. This is exactly what we endeavored to do in Oklahoma City, facing enormous number of deaths and injuries, but we took care at each step to make sure that the law was followed. We are doing the same with respect to the January 6th investigation. The U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Columbia is the lead force along on the prosecution side, and the FBI on the law enforcement side. Both are subject to ongoing supervision by the National Security Division in the Justice Department, by the Deputy Attorney General and myself. So we take your point completely. I can't talk, as you obviously recognize, about a particular case, but we look carefully, and we will revise our perceptions as new facts arise. I can't tell you how long this will take. This is only at this point around 145 days or so. It's relatively short in the lifetime of an investigation, particularly one that has required such a large number of separate investigations in different places as far-flung as Alaska, and a huge amount of data to be examined in video that's been made available. So the investigation is not over, and we will pursue each lead till we're confident that we have reached the end.
Thank you for that. Mr. Secretary, a lot of focus this week in the news about the shutdown of the Colonial Pipeline due to the series of cyber attacks. When you think about what we're discussing here in this committee right now, you've got the issues of immigration, you've got violent extremism, and certainly cyber in the news today. How is DHS balancing all of these very significant but clearly competing priorities? And if you can quickly describe how DHS is working with the Department of Energy and FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to help the industry counter these attacks to ensure that our critical energy infrastructure is secure.
Senator, thank you very much. Intensely proud of the men and women of the Department of Homeland Security in addressing the urgent threats that we face across the Homeland Security enterprise. You correctly note cyber security is one of those urgent threats, and just last week I spoke to the Chamber of Commerce and thousands of people across the country, representatives of small businesses, about ransomware, the very type of attack that Colonial Pipeline has experienced and that has galvanized correctly our attention. More than $350 million in losses are attributable to ransomware just this year, an over 300% increase over the last year. We have the capability to address and the dedication to address border security, cyber security threats, the security of our homeland in all dimensions. We are working at the direction of the President in an all-of-government way to address the cybersecurity threat that Colonial Pipeline suffered and that other businesses and institutions across our country are vulnerable to. We are looking at the Jones Act and the need to exercise our waiver authority to ensure that fuel carried by vessels can actually reach the impacted areas. We're working very closely with the Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, all across the government, including the Department of Defense and its logistics agency, to bring all of the resources and capabilities to bear to ensure the well-being of the American people and those impacted in the regions within Colonial Pipeline's jurisdiction.
Thank you, Senator Murkowski. We will take a 5-minute break now, and I understand our witnesses have a couple items that have come up. We'll take a 5-minute break and then come back. The, who's next? Shaheen? Where is she? See, Senator Shaheen is not here, so we'll go to Senator Coons.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our two distinguished witnesses. You are the right leaders for this difficult moment, and I am grateful for your service and for the agencies which you lead. 2 weeks ago, Senator Sass and I held a hearing of the subcommittee on privacy and technology where we focused on the role that social media platforms' algorithms play in amplifying misinformation and extremist content. Secretary Mayorkas, you noted in your testimony that you're increasing your department's efforts to assess how domestic extremists are leveraging social media and other online platforms. Can you tell us more about those efforts?
Thank you very much, Senator. The challenge really is, number one, the anonymity with which people are able to navigate through social media and really exploit the medium for improper and unlawful purposes, and two, the speed with which they can do so. And so what we are doing is dedicating analysts to understanding the narratives that are being communicated on the social media platforms and identifying linkages between those narratives and indicators of intention to commit violent acts. Right now, we are doing that through the human resource, not yet leveraging algorithms, but we are, of course, planning different methodologies as we proceed in this endeavor.
Attorney General Garland, you and other leaders, in fact, Chris Wray at the FBI has also spoken about self-radicalization. And I assume that what that really means is folks who are largely sitting at home and consuming hours and hours of extremist content through YouTube and Facebook and other social media platforms. Would you agree that if platforms have algorithms that are actually designed to hold the attention of viewers and to engage them by delivering more and more extremist content to people who start going down these so-called rabbit holes, then they, perhaps unintentionally, are fueling some of this problem, and we should take some actions to help address that challenge?
Well, I agree with Secretary Mayorkas that what's happening on our social media platforms certainly can lead to self-radicalization. The precise mechanism, I'm no expert on, and I wouldn't want to pretend to be. But self-radicalization does, we've seen it most dangerously with respect to those who are influenced by jihadist websites, who watch those websites over and over again and become persuaded and then self-radicalized. And this accelerates very quickly. Somebody can go from a circumstance where no one around them thinks that they are likely to be a violent extremist to one who then acts out. And I think that this is the way in modern society people get this information is through the internet.
And I notice an increase in budgetary requests in both of your departments to fund grant programs that build state and local capacity and to increase funding for U.S. attorneys' offices. Will any of that go towards further research on this exact point? And will any of that go to help focus on what the mental health issues are that might make people more vulnerable to recruitment or radicalization, and what the local initiatives might be that could help tamp down or deter radicalization?
If I may, if I may take that, Senator Coons, a few efforts, if I may. Number one, we help resource centers of excellence to conduct research in precisely the area that you have identified. We have grant programs to equip and enable local communities to conduct research and also to develop programs that are in fact focused on mental health issues and a holistic approach to the challenge that we face. That is precisely one of the reasons why we actually changed an office's name to become the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships. It's about prevention first and foremost, which does include mental health efforts, and partnership, working with our state, local, tribal, territorial partners to equip them in the communities to develop these programs, to develop educational efforts, as well as response and resilience programs.
Thank you. Anything you wanted to add?
Yes, and the same for us. So the National Institute of Justice did a study on just this topic, understanding domestic radicalization and terrorism, which came out last year, which I mentioned in my written statements. We have $4 million in our budget request for them to continue and to do further analysis of root causes of radicalization.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I've read that police officers have encounters every year with about 60 million Americans. And in 10 million of those encounters, the person who has an encounter with the cop is arrested. And in 2 million of those encounters, the police officer either has to use force or threaten to use force. Now, every case is different and needs to be investigated when violence is, or when force is used or threatened to be used. We had a very unfortunate event happen, as you know, in Columbus, Ohio, last month. A police officer who happens to be white shot a young woman who happened to be an African American as she, at least according to the video, was about to stab another young woman who happened to be African American. All we had at the time was this video. We had nothing else. Nothing else. And I think it's still being investigated. Put this up for me right quick. We had an NBA, a National Basketball Association athlete, immediately after this happened, put out an Instagram post identifying the police officer. Here's his face. And this is what the NBA player said: "You're next." Do you think that contributes to domestic violence in America?
Senator, I can't comment on a particular case that is under investigation, nor can I comment on a case when I don't know all of the facts, and I hope you do understand that. I served 12 years as a federal prosecutor.
Yes, sir.
And I understand.
Well, let me put it another way. I understand you.
Please, if you would frame it more generally, perhaps.
Sure. Would you have sent out an Instagram like this?
Senator, I think you know the answer to that question.
No? Is the answer no?
That is correct, and I'd like to, if I can, amplify something very important that my colleague, the Attorney General, articulated.
Okay, before you do, my time is so limited. And I want to ask the General a question because I'm going to run out of time. And then if it's okay, Mr. Secretary, I'll come back to you.
I'd welcome that.
Thank you, sir. General, I appreciate all your efforts. I think it's fair to say that Chicago has become, unfortunately, the world's largest outdoor shooting range. What's the Department of Justice doing to help remedy this problem in Chicago?
Well, violent crime has been a priority of the Justice Department since I first entered the department. Since I was last in the department, that may have been the first time the department actually created an anti-violent crime initiative, which has now, over the years, had different names. We are going to put a large amount of money into grants with respect to violent crimes, gang violence, BJA, Bureau of Justice Assistance grants. We spend $8.6 billion in FY21 on violent crime, both on prevention.
But what about Chicago?
Yeah, on the specifics of Chicago, I don't know, but we will provide the resources that the city needs to assist it in its efforts against violent crime. I don't know specifically, although having been born and raised in Chicago, I'm at least as concerned as you are about violent crime in that city.
Yeah, so you're giving them money?
We're giving them money, and we have law enforcement. We have a United States Attorney's Office, we have the FBI, we have the DEA, we have the ATF, we have the U.S. Marshals. All are focused on many different areas, but one of which is violent crime, and in particular, gang violence.
Okay. Let me get back to the Secretary. I think he had something he wanted
Oh,
to
thank you
say.
so much for the opportunity.
Yes, sir.
We take great pride in the fact that as a department, we have statutorily created offices of privacy and civil rights and civil liberties. And it is a very, very important constitutionally, as a matter of constitutional law, that we both protect and safeguard individuals' right of speech and right of assembly. Yet we address with all our law enforcement capabilities those who really predicate acts of violence on false narratives and dangerous ideologies. And it's the acts of violence that we are focused upon. But I wanted to draw a clear line, which is not always easy to draw, but we're very focused on it because it speaks to the principles and values that guide everything that we do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you both, Secretary Mayorkas. We look forward to seeing you before the subcommittee later this year to talk about the department's budget request. Thank you both for your service to protect the country. I have two questions, three if I have time. The first is with respect to comments that you both made regarding the access that domestic extremist groups have to weapons and bomb-making materials. I would note that the incredibly disturbing story of the 13 individuals in Michigan who were very far along in a plot to kidnap and try for treason the governor of Michigan had in their possession upwards of 70 firearms, an arsenal that included many AR-15 style rifles, ghost guns, guns that are designed by their nature to be untraceable, and 2,000 rounds of ammunition. I'll direct this to you, Attorney General Garland, because you are undergoing right now a review about the ways in which we can make sure that firearms are traceable for law enforcement purposes. You volunteered this in your testimony, as I think Secretary Mayorkas did. What are your concerns regarding the ability of these groups to arm themselves with significant weaponry and weaponry that increasingly is very difficult, if not impossible, to trace?
So I appreciate your picking up on the point that I was making. I think the increased availability of extraordinarily lethal weaponry is what makes domestic violent extremism and domestic terrorism such a serious priority for the Justice Department and DHS and of concern to the country. We are putting a significant amount of money into our investigations of domestic violent extremist terrorist groups. We have a budget request of $1.6 billion for ATF for the work that it does, on this, and another request for $401 million for state and local grants. On the specific question you asked about traceability, we have just issued a notice of proposed rulemaking with respect to ghost guns, which, as you point out, do not have serial numbers, but equally important, they are because they are sold as kits, are not necessarily. It's not necessarily clear that they were subject to background checks when they were sold. So under the rule, they would both be subject to background checks, and the manufacturers would be required to put serial numbers on them, and a licensed firearms dealer who comes into possession of one without a serial number would be required to put one on it.
I will remind the committee on this general topic that right now, individuals that are on what we would commonly refer to as the terrorist watch list, are able to buy weapons in gun stores today. They're not automatically added to the list of those that are prohibited to purchase weapons. It's inconceivable to me that at least on that topic we cannot find common ground. Turning to the question of the border, Secretary Mayorkas, Senator Shelby raised the question of border security at a hearing about domestic extremism, and I wanted to sort of ask you to give an assessment of the risk of terrorists entering this country through the southern border. Important to remember that undocumented immigrants in this country have a lower arrest rate than U.S. citizens. And from what I can understand, there's fairly scant evidence that international extremist groups are using the southwest border as a mechanism to bring their members into the country. What evidence do we have that the southwest border is being used by international extremist groups or domestic extremist groups to try to bring individuals into this country to do harm to American citizens?
Senator, we don't have any evidence that suggests that the threat on the border with respect to foreign terrorists is any greater today than it was last year, the year prior, or the years over the past decade. The fact of the matter is that we are vigilant in guarding against foreign terrorist influences through all avenues, not just, of course, our land borders, but air and maritime. That is what we do, and fortunately, we have extraordinary capabilities to address it.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and by earlier agreement, Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, in listening to the tone and direction of the conversation today, that idea of hierarchy, priority between domestic terrorism and threats from afar, to me, it is easy to get into a false equivalency there. I'm going to use my reason for discussion of the visit I made down to the border a little over a month ago. And I think also it's kind of tricky when you generalize on something like January 6th, with all of us acknowledge as being a horrific occurrence here in the Capitol. I want to cite a couple things that really stood out when I was there. And this would be kind of the rule of numbers being something that we should be most concerned about. 150,000 illegal crossings in March. Just saw it on the tube today, 178,000 in April, 14,000 of whom would have been unaccompanied minors. When I was down there, that was the part that looked most tragic from a humanity point of view. But the thing that caught me more than anything, and it sticks in my mind like it was yesterday, we get down to the border at the Rio Grande, and of course nothing was happening as we arrived, and then the heckling that floated across the river from smugglers and coyotes. I asked, what were they saying? We're going to keep doing it regardless of what you try to do to stop it. Now, that might be an idle threat, other than I think it's arrived now at close to $1.5 to $2 billion business, where you've got a logistics enterprise in the country. And I think the tragic thing is, so much of it is about people trying to escape a life that forces them on that journey. Here's the point that stuck in my mind, and this wasn't in the RGV, it was in the Del Rio district. And this is the Border Patrol telling me everything I'm telling you, that 54 different nationalities crossed the border in the 3 months prior to our visit. Now, questions of, do we have more threat of terrorists from afar that come across? Or I think it makes sense, domestic folks or people on domestic terrorism crossing the border. I guess I wouldn't rule that out. But just by that volume, it would seem to me that we need to be more worried about what could happen again based upon 9/11 than maybe something that happened here on January 6th, horrific, but might have been more to do with lack of security and having a place that was easy to breach. And not saying that that was the reason, and we shouldn't look at all angles. I just wonder, because I also heard you say, and my question is going to be for you, Secretary Mayorkas, multifaceted. I agree with we need to do something. I heard you say earlier about addressing the smugglers, the coyotes, the operation that is benefiting from it. But here is what the Border Patrol told us as well. The two most effective things, by far, this is the Border Patrol, would have been the wall in high traffic places. Now that has gaps in it, and maybe just out of politics, we're refusing to complete it to make it easy for them. They said that was number one. Number two was a stay in Mexico policy, because at least we don't have what we've got now. And at the Donna facility that I witnessed, it was worse than it had ever been. And now we've spread that out among other locations, maybe to take that kind of bad look away. Two questions. It was working. We were at a 45-year low. Will you try to complete the border wall, even if you don't do any more, where you've got gaps in it, gates not working? And will you try to reinstitute the stay in Mexico policy, at least until we get this thing down to a manageable level? And that's not trying to spread out all the people that come across the border currently. 150, 178 is at 200,000 in May. Just would love to know what you're intending to do.
Senator, thank you. There's a lot packed in there, so yes. I'm going to try to be concise. We are indeed focused on smugglers and traffickers, as I mentioned earlier. That has been a many years problem. We do, in fact, take a multifaceted approach to securing our border. I remember my conversation with Senator McCain about the fact that we need to use physical borders, technology, and personnel. The border is very dynamic. It is changing. And when we speak of physical barriers, the ability to be mobile is critically important. I think there's something very important to articulate in response to your point about the foreign threats and the domestic threats. The foreign threats persist. It's not as though they have disappeared. But the threat landscape is always evolving. We have collectively, the Attorney General and I and our partners across the federal government enterprise, have our eye on the foreign threat as well as the domestic threat. We don't take our eye off one and focus on the other.
Thank you.
We are reviewing the gaps, the gates, and seeing what is the best response to achieve our security while upholding our values and principles as a country.
What about the stay in Mexico policy, just very quickly, because I know we're out of time?
That is not something that we as an administration have continued.
Thank you.
And thank you. I'm sorry, Carl, we're going to have votes soon. Senator Shaheen, you are next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both of you for being here today and for your testimony. I want to go back to the extremist, domestic extremists versus national organizations. And one of the concerns that I have, which I'm sure you share, is the one that Senator Reid referenced about the connections between some of our domestic violent extremist organizations and international terrorist groups. There's been reporting of Americans involved with those right-wing extremist groups in the U.S. communicating online and sometimes traveling overseas for training with other extremist groups, and not just in Russia, although we know of at least one leader of the base who has resettled to St. Petersburg, Russia. So can you talk about the extent to which you're seeing an increase, or if you are seeing an increase in those connections, and what we're doing to try and address that?
Yes, Senator.
For either of you.
Yes, Senator. Well, you're right to be concerned. I can't give a sense of the magnitude of the problem, but I do think that we have to worry about interactions between domestic violent extremists, particularly racially motivated and ethnically motivated ones, where there are similar groups, particularly in Europe, with similar ideological bents, sharing information, and we have the benefit in that respect of being able to coordinate with our national intelligence partners, and the Director of National Intelligence is very seized with this problem. The seam that was talked about before in one of the other questions is one that we have worked very hard to eliminate, where there is a foreign aspect of the risk, and our intelligence agency partners whose eyes are abroad are being very cooperative in that respect. But we are looking at this problem, and it is very much on our mind.
And if I can add one point, Senator, if I may, the Attorney General and I participated in a multi-nation ministerial, and of course, the issue of violent extremism was uppermost in our minds, and it's something that we share with our partners and are working very closely together with them to address.
One of the potential sources, this is not specifically on domestic terrorism, but one of the potential sources of international terrorist activity are the detainee camps that have resulted from the crisis in Syria and Iraq with ISIS, and there are now tens of thousands of people in those detainee camps that are really serving as an incubator for further terrorist activity. I, along with my colleagues on the Armed Services Committee, put in language in, I believe, 2 years ago to create an ISIS or a detainee coordinator to work with not only our government but other governments that were the home of some of those detainees who have been in custody as the result of the military activities in Syria and Iraq. And no one has yet been appointed to that position. I don't know if either of you were aware that that had even passed and exists, but it seems to me that that would be an opportunity for us as we're thinking about future international terrorist activities to begin to have a way to address what's happening in those detainee camps and to try and get some of those foreign detainees repatriated into the countries where they came from.
Senator, that's something certainly we'll commit to looking into. I'm not expert in that area. I will say in the area where I am expert, in the refugee camps with individuals who have fled persecution by reason of their membership in particular social groups, we are aware of influences potentially in those camps, and of course we modify our screening and vetting of those individuals accordingly, and that's based on the expertise and qualifications of our refugee officers. But I will look at the issue of the detainee coordinator and follow up. We look forward to following up with you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I just have one final question, and that is I'm a little troubled by the suggestion of some at the hearing that this is a question of should we focus on the southern border and illegal immigration, or should we focus on domestic violent extremism? And I'm sure you both would agree that we've got to do both, and that none of us want to see more illegal immigration any more than we want to see domestic terrorists increase. But Secretary Mayorkas, do you think that statements made by public officials claiming that the 2020 presidential election was stolen or the result of fraud increase the threat of violence by domestic extremists? Have we seen that as we're pursuing, also for the Attorney General, as we're pursuing the cases against those people involved on January 6th? Has that been something that we've heard from the defendants?
Senator, first, yes, we can do both. We can secure our border, and we can effectively combat the rise of domestic violent extremism, and I want to make sure that we draw a clear line between those two, even though we can address both. Those are two very, very different challenges. Senator, false narratives, the spread of false narratives are used to fuel extremist ideologies, and we're focused on the connection between extremist ideologies and the threat or intention to commit acts of violence.
And is there any evidence that elected official statements have contributed to that?
We do see in the narratives that we have studied the fact that false narratives attributed to public officials gain traction in social media.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hoven.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was recently down at the border with fellow senators. Actually, Senator Shaheen and I toured the border together a number of years back when we chaired and were ranking member on DHS Appropriations Subcommittee. So I've been down there before, previously as well. When I talk to the Border Patrol agents, they tell me they need barriers, technology, and people to address the situation. Do you agree with that?
I do, Senator, and it's something I've spoken of in this hearing.
So then what about continuing completion of the wall, particularly where it's already been contracted for construction? That's something they said they want and need to control the border.
Senator, not all physical barriers are the same, and one of the things that we've learned in our multi-year study of the border is the fact that the challenges at the border are quite dynamic, not only because of variables in topography, but variables month to month and sometimes year to year with respect to the movement of people and the methodologies they employ.
Would you agree with me when you talk to your Border Patrol agents, they tell you they need barriers, physical barriers, technology, and people? They right now have a situation where there were almost 180,000 migrants coming across the border illegally just in the month of April. That'd be almost 2 million annualized, almost 18,000 unaccompanied minors. They're saying they don't have time to do their job securing the border because they need the three things I just mentioned: barriers, technology, and people. Do you agree with the professionals down there that say they need those things, or disagree with them, and are you getting them those things?
Senator, if I can just complete the thought that I was about to complete, if I may, that I remember when I was the Deputy Secretary and we were analyzing the utility and effectiveness of fixed towers, and then we said, you know what, we can actually move more effectively from fixed towers to mobile towers because of the dynamism of which I spoke a minute ago. And I have spoken with the Border Patrol. I've been down to the border multiple times, and on each visit, spoken with the men and women who secure our border, and one will discern different approaches and different opinions with respect to the challenges of the border. And it is ultimately my responsibility to pursue those instruments and tools that I consider most effective in the service of American people.
I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary. I only have 5 minutes for questions, so I'm trying to get my questions in. So towers are technology. I asked you about a barrier. And the Border Patrol says they need all three. And so, yes, whether you have mobile or fixed tower, that's technology. I'm asking you barriers, technology, and people. And on the people question, if you don't change the protocols, the third safe country and the Remain in Mexico, how are you going? Your people down there are overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed, these professionals. How are they going to be able to do their job so that they can handle what's going on the southern border? I live on the northern border. People from the northern border are at about half the normal staffing level because they're going down to help on the southern border. What are you doing to get on top of the flow so that we can not only manage our southern border, but I'm also asking for your help on the northern border to get our people back and get staffed at the level on the northern border?
Senator, we are vigilant in securing all of the borders and all of the avenues. We have a three-part plan, or I should say 3 pillars to our plan. One is to address the root causes and to deter individuals from seeking the dangerous and perilous journey by addressing the reasons why they feel forced to flee the countries in which they live and in which they want to raise their children. We are also building legal pathways so that there are avenues of relief under the laws that the United States Congress has passed, and they don't feel compelled by dint of the tragic circumstances in their countries of origin to take the perilous journey. And lastly is our dedication and commitment and our prioritization of achieving immigration reform, because we are all in agreement, regardless of party, that the current immigration system is fundamentally broken.
But your metric, based on what you're doing right now, is that in April, almost 180,000 migrants crossed illegally, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down. It seems to be increasing. So, again, back to doing what the professionals are asking for. I asked you that question. I didn't get an answer in terms of specifics. I guess it's also now affecting the northern border. Are you willing to help us with the issues on the northern border? That's simple, yes or no?
Senator, the answer is yes, and the Department of Homeland Security's obligations is to secure all of our borders, and the challenge of migration is not specific.
Would you say that's happening now? Based on what's going on the border, do you feel that that's a secure border?
Yes, Senator, I do, and let me just say that the challenge of migration is not a new phenomenon in 2021. We experienced tremendous surge in migration in 2019, in 2016, in 2014, and many years prior.
How does it compare to last year with the policies that were in place last year?
Senator, the surge in migration is greater this year thus far than we observed and experienced in 2020.
Thank you.
And
2020 was less
are you
than
willing
what
to
it
make
was in
changes to your
2019.
current policy to address that?
Senator, yes, I am.
Okay.
And I will.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
I've
Secretary Garland?
I've tried to be flexible, but a vote has started, and the Senator's over this time. We have one more senator.
All right, Mr.
If they could be heard, then the witnesses will be able to go on.
I'll submit my other questions for the record. Thank you.
And I would urge that his questions as submitted be answered.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of you for your service and for your testimony today. Both of you referenced in your testimony the March Intelligence Community report on domestic violent extremism poses heightened threat, and both of you and your departments had input into that report. The very first finding in the executive summary of that report includes the following statement. Newer socio-political developments, such as narratives of fraud in the recent general election and the emboldening impact of the violent breach of the U.S. Capitol, will almost certainly spur some domestic violent extremists to try to engage in violence this year. Mr. Attorney General, do you agree with that finding?
I do. That's a finding of all three of the entities that wrote the report and of the intelligence community as a whole.
And Mr. Secretary, do you concur?
I do as well, Senator.
Well, Senator Shaheen raised this issue, and I really don't think we can just gloss over it. It's not just a question of a lie about the elections. It's not only a question of deception. That's bad enough. As this intelligence community report points out, it can have lethal consequences. In fact, they predict that it will almost certainly spur some domestic violent extremists. Gentlemen, yesterday on the floor of the House, Congresswoman Liz Cheney said the following, and I'm quoting, "Today we face a threat America has never seen before. A former president who provoked a violent attack on this Capitol in an effort to steal the election has resumed his aggressive effort to convince Americans that the election was stolen from him. He risks inciting further violence." Do you agree with that statement, which is consistent with the finding in the intelligence community report?
Senator, let me say this: that false narratives create a lack of confidence in our democratic institutions, and sometimes worse. And those false narratives can lead people who are predisposed to violence to commit acts of violence against our institutions. And tragically, we saw that on January 6th.
Well, thank you. Mr. Attorney General, you're doing the investigations into what happened here at the Capitol on January 6th. And isn't it a fact that many of the people that you've talked to and are pursuing have said they were inspired to commit the violence because of President Trump's claims that the election was stolen. Isn't that a fact?
Because this is an ongoing investigation, the department's longstanding principle is to not talk about what we've learned in the investigation other than through the filings that we make in the court. We have, in each of the cases of arrests and also search warrants, reproduced some elements of what people have told us. And I think that's the place to look, but I don't think it's an appropriate thing for me as supervising those prosecutions to make any comments outside of the court record.
Well, much of this is in the public domain. Not asking you for the internal findings of your investigation at this point in time. I understood the response to Senator Shaheen's question, and certainly this Intelligence Committee report indicates that those kind of false narratives have dangerous consequences. Is that not true?
Most certainly, and it's something that we're very focused on addressing. False narratives, as I mentioned, create strands of dialogue that we see propagated on social media, and then we see those strands picked up on, and we are detecting connectivity between those strands and an intention to commit violent acts, and that is what we are focused on.
Mr. Attorney General?
Yeah, so if you put it at that level of generality rather than the specific questions about people being investigated in a particular circumstance, it is right, as the Intelligence Community has reported, that particularly those who end up committing acts of domestic violence get ideas from the internet and from statements, and where there are false narratives and false statements. Those are the kind of things that can, depending upon the person in the end who acts out, lead to violence.
Well, look, I disagree with Congresswoman Liz Cheney on a lot of things, but I think everybody needs to stand with her regardless of political party when she stands up to talk about the truth. And what she is saying in her floor remarks squares fully with the finding from this Intelligence Community report that both your departments participated in. And the report it's not ambiguous here. It says these kind of false narratives will almost certainly spur domestic violent extremists to try to engage in violence this year. So, Mr. Chairman, I would just encourage all of our colleagues to recognize that words matter. I mean, people have a First Amendment right, and they can say what they want, but they should also recognize the very dangerous consequences of the false narratives that continue to be peddled around this place and coming from the former president. Thank you.
Thank you, and I thank all the witnesses who are here today and our committee members who are here. We'll keep the hearing record open for a week. If senators have written questions to submit, please do so by 5 p.m. next Wednesday, May 19th. We have 2 more full committee hearings scheduled in the coming months. The next will be on May 25th on global leadership in the State Department budget with Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The other full committee will be in mid-June with Defense Secretary Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Milley. As I said, I gavelled the close, but as a courtesy to Senator Hagerty, who just came in, the vote has started, but we will limit it to the 5 minutes. Senator Hagerty.
Thank you, Chairman Leahy. I appreciate that. Secretary Mayorkas, welcome. I just checked your department's website this morning, and according to the data on your website, 92% of the people of the illegal aliens that ICE has deported have been convicted or charged with crimes here. 92%. Yet the ICE deportations under your administration have plummeted dramatically. Now, we know the surge is occurring at the border. We know many more people are arriving here illegally. Yet the deportations have gone down. That means that we have more criminals being deposited into our nation every day. I want to talk with you about the resources that we've committed to this problem and how law-abiding Americans can feel more comfortable knowing that this increase and criminal elements is occurring in their communities. It's occurring in my state of Tennessee. Isn't it correct that you're choosing not to deport these people, that ICE is not deporting these people and increasing the risk to American citizens?
Senator, that is actually not correct. And if I may, I served for 12 years as a federal prosecutor, and some of those years I was privileged to have our current Attorney General in the Department of Justice headquarters here in Washington, D.C. The criminal justice system is based on qualitative outcomes, not quantitative. And we are focused on the greatest threats to public safety because we do not have limited resources. And so our focus is on three priorities: national security, public safety, and border security. And we're delivering consequences as well we should to most effectively serve those priorities. It's qualitative, not quantitative. And
from a quantitative perspective, what we've seen is a massive drop in deportations. Last year, between 10 and 20,000 deportations per month. Under your administration, that number's dropped to 3,000 to 2,500 per month. You've got 2,500 agents, 2,500 ICE agents. They're down to deporting one criminal per month versus 5 per month last year.
Senator,
Did the number of criminals drop that much?
I didn't mean to interrupt. Senator, let me put this in context, because there is one data point that we shouldn't take off the table and neglect to consider, which is the fact that for a good deal of the year thus far, and certainly with respect to the fiscal year, our agents, our brave men and women on the front lines, were addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. And for a period of that time, they were not fully deployed for reasons that we can all agree upon. And so we have to remember to consider that and the constraints on our facilities and our resources in a time of extraordinary pandemic. But be that as it may, the fundamental point is key, that it's qualitative. And I would rather, as an individual supervising law enforcement and as a former assistant United States attorney prosecuting crimes, I would rather dedicate resources to an individual who poses the greatest public safety threat, and the apprehension and removal of which may take a greater amount of time and a greater amount of resources than someone who's been here for 25 years, who has not committed an offense, and yet can swallow up resources that we can best otherwise use.
I'm talking about people that have committed crimes and been charged with crimes. Last year, during the pandemic, you mentioned the pandemic as an excuse. Last year, even during the pandemic, we were deporting 6,000 per month. Now those numbers have dropped to less than half of that.
Senator, we have, if I may, we have defined our public safety, national security, and border security threats to most effectively address them and combat them, so that our consequence regime is brought to bear on the greatest threats that we confront.
So we see a dramatic decrease in the number of criminals being deported as a result. Secretary, is it true that you've received more funding from this committee on a bipartisan basis for your criminal alien program, more funding than you had last year?
I believe that is correct.
That is correct. Isn't it true that you got more funding for fugitive operations than you had last year?
That is correct as well, Senator.
And isn't it true that you've got capacity to house between 18 and 20,000 deportation prospects that's going unused right now?
That is correct as well.
How is it then that with more resources, you're accomplishing such fewer number of deportations? How is it that the results could have plummeted so much with more money from this Appropriations Committee?
Senator, if I may repeat an answer I provided, which is our focus is on quality, not quantity, and sometimes achieving qualitative results can consume considerable resources.
Well, I think going beyond axe murderers to people that have committed other grave crimes should be your focus as well. You should utilize this capacity and utilize the funds that we've provided you more effectively.
The Senator
Thank you,
from Tennessee, who was not here for all the hearing, but we reopened the hearing to enable him to have his 5 minutes, and he will be able to submit questions. I thank, on behalf of myself and Senator Shelby, we thank the witnesses. Thank you for this hearing, and we stand adjourned.